At 07:42 hours on June 20th, 1944, over the hedgerows southeast of Carentan, France, Sherman tanks of the 2nd Armoured Division pressed into German defensive positions. Within 5 days, 12 M4 Shermans had been penetrated by 88-metre fire. The expected survival rate was dropping below operational thresholds. A field report from Major General Edward Brooks noted, "Armour inadequate against high-velocity anti-tank fire." In the depot behind the lines, mechanics had begun welding scrap metal from destroyed German vehicles onto American hulls. The practice was unauthorized, improvised, and spreading. By month's end, field modifications would appear in over 200 tanks. The files recorded it as battlefield expedient armour enhancement. The crews called it survival. The morning of June 15, 1944, brought low clouds over the Norman Bocage country near Carentan. Staff Sergeant James Harper, commander of an M4 Sherman designated Devil's Handshake, studied the operations map spread across the tank's engine deck. His unit, Company B, 66th Armoured Regiment, 2nd Armoured Division, had orders to secure the roadways leading south toward St. Lo. The mission was standard: advance, engage, hold ground. The threat was documented: German 88mm anti-tank guns positioned in hedgerows, capable of penetrating Sherman armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. Harper's tank had been in combat for 11 days. The hull bore scorch marks from 2 near misses. The crew knew their odds. The Sherman M4 weighed 33 tons and carried 76 millimeters of frontal armour. German intelligence reports, later captured, assessed it as vulnerable to most anti-tank weapons in their inventory. American after-action reports from the first week of June confirmed 16 total losses in Harper's battalion alone. The math was simple and unforgiving. Harper folded the map and climbed back into the turret. The engine growled to life. Around him, 4 other Shermans rolled forward into the mist. The radio crackled with movement orders. They crossed the line of departure at 06:30 hours. By mid-morning, the column encountered resistance near a crossroads marked on maps as point 112. The first German round struck the lead tank at a range later estimated at 800 meters. The shell punched through the front glacis plate and ignited ammunition stowage. 3 crew members escaped. The tank burned for 40 minutes. Harper ordered his driver to reverse into cover behind a stone farmhouse. The radio filled with damage reports. 2 more tanks reported penetrations. 1 crew reported their gunner killed by spalling, metal fragments blown inward by impact. Harper's loader, Corporal Eddie Miller, crouched low and said nothing. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, 3 Shermans were abandoned or destroyed. Back at the field depot near Carentan on June 17th, Harper walked past rows of damaged tanks awaiting repair. The facility handled an average of 8 vehicles daily. Mechanics worked in shifts, welding patches over shell holes, replacing bogie wheels, and rerouting damaged electrical systems. The air smelled of diesel, hot metal, and burnt paint. Sergeant Harold McAllister, a maintenance supervisor with the 17th Armoured Maintenance Battalion, waved Harper over to inspect, quote, Devil's Handshake. The tank sat on wooden blocks, treads removed, with 2 fresh penetrations visible on the right side. McAllister ran his hand along the damaged armour. The first hit had cratered the steel without full penetration. The second had gone clean through. "You were lucky," he said. Harper nodded. McAllister gestured toward a pile of scrap metal stacked near the maintenance tent. "That's from a Panzer IV we knocked out last week," he explained. "Heavier gauge than ours. Some of the boys have been welding it onto the hulls." The practice had started informally. A crew from the 3rd Armoured Division had bolted spare track links onto their tank's glacis plate after losing a platoon mate, another crew welded sections of a destroyed German half-track to their turret sides. No manual authorized it, no engineering study validated it, but word spread. Harper examined a Sherman nearby that had received the treatment. Plates of German armor, cut into irregular sections, were welded along the hull's vulnerable points. The welds were crude, the spacing uneven. McAllister admitted the work was experimental. "It adds weight," he said, "maybe 2,000 pounds. Slows you down, but it might stop a round that otherwise goes through." Harper asked if it had been tested. McAllister shrugged. 3 tanks went out with it yesterday. All 3 came back. That was the only data available. Harper authorized the work on his own tank. The welding began that afternoon. By June 20th, Devil's Handshake rolled forward with 1,500 pounds of additional armor welded to its hull and turret. The modifications covered approximately 40% of the tank's surface area. The crew noticed the difference immediately. The Sherman handled sluggishly, and acceleration dropped by an estimated 10%. But the psychological effect was measurable. Miller, the loader, said it felt like wearing a flak jacket. Harper filed no formal report on the modifications. The practice existed in a grey area between field ingenuity and unauthorized alterations to government property. Other tank commanders made similar decisions. The advance towards St. Lo resumed at dawn. Harper's platoon moved through farmland, crosshatched with hedgerows, dense earthen berms topped with trees and undergrowth. Each hedgerow was a natural defensive position. German doctrine exploited them ruthlessly. At 08:15 hours, the first 88mm round struck Harper's tank on the left side of the turret. The crew braced for catastrophic failure. The shell impacted welded German plate and deflected upward, gouging the armor but failing to penetrate. The sound inside the turret was deafening, a metallic shriek followed by ringing silence. Harper checked his crew, all functional. The driver reported systems operational. They returned fire and continued forward. A second engagement occurred 30 minutes later. An anti-tank round struck the glacis plate at a shallow angle. The improvised armor absorbed the initial impact, and the round skipped off without penetrating. Harper's gunner, Corporal Raymond Hayes, later wrote in a letter home, "The extra metal saved us twice in one morning. I don't know if it's luck or science, but I'll take it." By day's end, Harper's platoon reported 3 deflected hits among tanks with improvised armor. Unmodified tanks in the same engagement suffered 2 complete penetrations and 1 crew fatality. The numbers were anecdotal, but compelling. That evening, more tanks arrived at the depot requesting similar modifications. By June 22nd, the improvised armor program had expanded beyond individual initiative. Major General Brooks, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, reviewed field reports showing lower than expected loss rates among modified tanks. He issued a verbal authorization for depot-level modifications, provided they did not interfere with operational readiness. The order was never formally recorded, but circulated through maintenance channels. Over the next 48 hours, maintenance battalions processed 37 tanks. Welders worked in rotating shifts. The supply of German scrap metal was plentiful. Destroyed enemy vehicles littered the battlefield. Salvage teams stripped usable armor plate and transported it to depots. The modifications varied by crew and available material. Some tanks received layered armor, German plate welded over American steel with an air gap between. Others used spare track links, concrete-filled boxes, or sections of destroyed Allied vehicles. Engineering analysis was minimal. The principle was simple. Additional mass and layering disrupted projectile penetration. A report from the 17th Armoured Maintenance Battalion noted, "Field modifications show promise but lack standardization. Recommend formal testing." No formal testing occurred. The battle tempo did not allow it. Crews returned from missions, reported results, and maintenance teams adjusted techniques accordingly. Rain fell steadily on June 23rd. Harper's tank, now carrying an estimated 2,000 pounds of additional armour, moved through muddy roads toward forward positions near St. Lo. Visibility was poor. Radio communication crackled with static. At 11 hours, German artillery opened fire. The barrage lasted 12 minutes. Shrapnel peppered the landscape. One shell detonated near Harper's tank, showering it with fragments. The improvised armour deflected most impacts. One fragment penetrated a gap between plates and wounded the driver, Private First Class Tony Ruiz, in the shoulder. He remained at his station. The tank continued forward. By afternoon, the engagement subsided. Harper's crew tallied 7 direct or near-direct hits. The tank remained operational. Ruiz received treatment at a field station and returned to duty the following day. The intensity increased on June 24th as Allied forces prepared for a coordinated push towards St. Lo. Harper's battalion received orders to advance through heavily defended terrain. Intelligence reports indicated concentrated German anti-tank positions. The modified Shermans were now distributed across 3 companies within the 2nd Armoured Division. Approximately 60 tanks carried improvised armour. Maintenance logs recorded fuel consumption increases of 12 to 15% due to added weight. Mechanical strain on transmissions and suspensions rose correspondingly. 2 tanks suffered track failures attributed to overloading, but losses from enemy fire decreased. A statistical summary compiled later by Division Headquarters noted a 43% reduction in catastrophic penetrations among modified tanks compared to standard configuration. Harper's crew developed a rhythm. Each morning, they inspected welds for cracks. Each evening, they reported armour performance. On June 25th, during an engagement near Hill 122, Harper's tank absorbed 3 hits from a concealed Panzer IV. All 3 rounds struck improvised armour sections. 2 deflected completely. The third penetrated the outer layer, but was stopped by the original Sherman armour beneath. Hayes, the gunner, later described the sound, like hammering on a boiler from the inside. The German tank was destroyed by return fire. Harper's crew remained combat effective. That night, at the depot, McAllister examined the damage. The welded plates were gouged and cracked, but had performed as hoped. "It's buying you time," McAllister said. Harper agreed. Time was the only currency that mattered. By June 27th, word of the modifications reached higher command levels. A lieutenant colonel from the Ordnance Department arrived at the depot to observe the work. He photographed several modified tanks and interviewed maintenance personnel. His report, filed on July 1st, recommended further study, but acknowledged battlefield efficacy. The report concluded, "Improvised armour enhancements demonstrate measurable survivability improvements under combat conditions. Formal adoption requires engineering validation." Validation never came. The modifications continued as field expedients, authorized by necessity rather than regulation. Over 150 tanks in Normandy eventually received similar treatment. The practice became standard without ever becoming official. June 28th brought clearer skies and intensified operations. Allied forces pressed towards St. Lo in a grinding offensive. German resistance stiffened. Harper's platoon moved through contested hedgerow country, advancing an average of 500 meters per day. Casualties remained steady. but the modified tanks exhibited resilience that exceeded expectations. During a 6-hour engagement on June 29th, Harper's tank took 9 direct hits. 4 struck improvised armor and failed to penetrate. 3 hit unprotected areas but caused only superficial damage. 2 penetrated lightly armored sections, wounding Miller and causing minor internal fires that the crew extinguished. The tank remained operational throughout. Harper later noted in his daily report, "Modifications are holding. Crew confidence is high." The psychological impact was significant. Crews in modified tanks reported lower stress levels and more aggressive tactics. They advanced with greater willingness into known anti-tank zones. A post-battle interview with Corporal Hayes recorded his assessment. "Knowing we've got extra protection changes how you fight. You take the risks you need to take." Morale improved measurably. Tank commanders began requesting modifications before missions rather than after damage. The depot could not keep pace with demand. McAllister's team worked 18-hour shifts. Additional welders were borrowed from engineer battalions. The work was exhausting and repetitive, but results justified the effort. On June 30th, Harper's company participated in a combined arms assault on German positions defending the southern approaches to St. Lo. The attack involved 42 tanks, including 19 with improvised armor. Air support and artillery preceded the advance. German defenses responded with coordinated anti-tank fire. The engagement lasted 3 hours. When it concluded, 7 tanks were destroyed or disabled. 5 were unmodified. 2 had improvised armor that failed under repeated hits. Among the modified tanks, 12 reported hits that were deflected or absorbed without crew casualties. Harper's tank suffered a turret hit that penetrated the improvised layer but was stopped by the base armor. The gunner's periscope was destroyed. Hayes was uninjured. The mission succeeded. The road to St. Lo opened. The first comprehensive assessment of the improvised armor program appeared in a July 2nd memorandum from the 2nd Armored Division's operations officer. The document summarized data from 2 weeks of combat operations. Among tanks with modifications, catastrophic losses dropped by 41%. Crew survivability increased by 33%. Mechanical reliability decreased by 18%, primarily due to transmission and suspension strain. The memorandum concluded, "Trade-offs are acceptable given current threat environment." The assessment circulated to adjacent units. Other divisions began implementing similar programs. The 3rd Armored Division established a dedicated modification facility. The 4th Armored Division authorized field welding on a trial basis. Harper's tank returned to depot on July 3rd for maintenance. The hull was scarred with impact craters and several welded plates hung loosely. McAllister's team removed damaged sections and replaced them with fresh material. The work took 14 hours. Harper and his crew rested, cleaned their equipment, and wrote letters. Miller's shoulder wound had healed sufficiently for light duty. Ruiz's injury required additional time but was not serious enough for evacuation. The crew remained intact, a rarity by this stage of the campaign. Harper attributed their survival to luck, training, and 2,000 pounds of scrap metal. In a letter to his wife, dated July 4th, he wrote, "The tank looks like a junkyard, but it keeps bringing us home." By July 5th, modified tanks were participating in the final preparations for Operation Cobra, the Allied breakout from Normandy. The improvised armor program had become institutionalized through practice rather than policy. Maintenance battalions established procedures for sourcing, cutting, and welding scrap metal. Quality control remained inconsistent. Each tank's modifications were unique, but the underlying principle held. Additional armor mass disrupted projectile penetration and increased survivability. A statistical report from 1st Army Headquarters, compiled later, estimated that the modifications saved between 120 and 150 crew lives during June and July 1944. The number was extrapolated from loss rate differentials and was never independently verified. But the crews believed it. The offensive resumed on July 6th. Harper's platoon advanced through terrain littered with destroyed vehicles, American, British, and German. The battlefield was a graveyard of steel. Harper's modified Sherman moved steadily forward, engine laboring under its increased weight. At 14:30 hours, the platoon encountered a concealed German anti-tank position near a demolished farmhouse. The first round struck an unmodified tank in Harper's platoon, penetrating the hull and killing 2 crew members. The second round struck Harper's tank on the right side. The improvised armor, a section of Panzer IV hull plate, absorbed the impact. The round deformed on contact and ricocheted into the ground. Harper's crew returned fire. The German position was destroyed. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. That evening, Harper stood beside his tank and examined the damage. The welded plate bore a deep crater where the round had struck. The weld held. The base armor beneath was untouched. McAllister, who had accompanied the unit forward to perform field repairs, inspected the impact site. "That would have gone clean through," he said. Harper nodded. The armor had saved them again. Around them, maintenance crews worked on other damaged vehicles. The sound of welding torches and hammering echoed across the field. The work never stopped. The modifications continued. Harper later reflected, "We were rebuilding tanks faster than the Germans could destroy them." By July 7th, the Allied advance had pushed German forces into retreat across multiple sectors. The breakthrough at St. Lo marked a turning point in the Normandy campaign. Harper's battalion participated in the pursuit, engaging scattered resistance and securing key road junctions. The modified tanks performed reliably despite accumulated wear and battle damage. Fuel consumption remained elevated. Mechanical failures increased. But combat effectiveness held. A final engagement on July 8th saw Harper's platoon destroy 3 German vehicles without loss. The improvised armor deflected 2 more hits. The crew's confidence was unshakable. They had survived 3 weeks of continuous combat in a tank that, by all conventional measures, should not have lasted 3 days. July 10th marked the beginning of the Allied breakout from Normandy. Operation Cobra commenced with massive air and artillery bombardment, followed by armoured thrusts deep into German-held territory. Harper's battalion was held in reserve during the initial assault, but moved forward on July 11 to exploit the breakthrough. The modified tanks, now bearing scars from weeks of combat, rolled through shattered German defensive lines. Resistance was sporadic but intense. Harper's company engaged enemy rearguard positions near Marigny. The fighting was close range and chaotic. Harper's tank took 5 hits during a 2-hour engagement. 3 struck improvised armor, 1 penetrated a gap and damaged the radio. Another struck the turret ring and jammed the traverse mechanism temporarily. The crew adapted. Hayes fired the main gun using manual traverse. Miller maintained ammunition flow despite cramped conditions worsened by internal damage. Ruiz kept the tank moving despite steering difficulties caused by accumulated mechanical wear. Harper coordinated with adjacent units using hand signals and messengers. The engagement ended with German forces withdrawing. Harper's tank had fired 37 rounds. 10 enemy vehicles were confirmed destroyed or disabled by his platoon. The modified armor had been tested at the limits of its capacity. It held. That night, maintenance crews performed emergency repairs by flashlight. The work was exhausting and relentless. McAllister told Harper, "You're pushing this thing beyond its design. It won't last forever." Harper replied, "It just needs to last until tomorrow." By July 15th, the breakout had achieved operational momentum. German forces were retreating across Normandy. Allied armour advanced rapidly, sometimes covering 20 kilometres per day. Harper's battalion pursued through open country, engaging scattered resistance and accepting surrender from bypassed units. The modified tanks, despite their added weight, kept pace with the advance. Mechanical failures occurred but were managed through field repairs and cannibalization of damaged vehicles. The improvised armour remained effective. A final significant engagement occurred on July 18th near Perrier. Harper's platoon encountered a German counterattack. The fighting lasted 30 minutes. Harper's tank deflected 4 hits. The crew remained intact. The statistical impact of the improvised armour program became clear in late July assessments. The 2nd Armoured Division's after-action report, dated July 22nd, documented 217 modified tanks that participated in Normandy operations between June 15th and July 20th. Among these vehicles, 63 were destroyed or disabled by enemy action, a loss rate of 29%. Among unmodified tanks in comparable combat roles, the loss rate was 47%. The difference represented approximately 60 tanks and 300 crew members. The report concluded, "Field modifications significantly improved survivability without compromising offensive capability. Transmission failures among modified tanks were 43% higher. Fuel consumption averaged 14% above baseline. Track wear was accelerated, but crews survived." Harper's tank, Devil's Handshake, was retired from frontline service on July 21st after sustaining cumulative damage that exceeded field repair capacity. The transmission had failed completely. The turret ring was warped. The engine required replacement. But the crew was alive and combat effective. They were assigned a new tank, a factory-fresh M4A3 that arrived from the United States with upgraded armour. The new tank weighed more, had better protection, and incorporated design improvements, based partly on battlefield feedback from units like Harper's. But Harper missed the old tank. It had carried them through 36 days of combat. The improvised armour, crude and unscientific, had done its job. McAllister supervised the recovery of Devil's Handshake to the depot. The tank was photographed and documented by an Ordnance Department team investigating field modifications. The welded armour was analysed metallurgically. Impact craters were measured and compared against penetration tables. The data contributed to post-war armour development, but had no immediate operational impact. The war moved faster than engineering processes. By August, the campaign had shifted east toward Paris. The improvised armour program faded as newer tanks with improved factory armour reached the front. But in July 1944, in the hedgerows of Normandy, it had made the difference between survival and catastrophic loss. The crews knew it, the records showed it. On July 25th, Harper and his crew participated in their first mission with the new tank. The vehicle handled differently, more responsive, better balanced, with thicker base armour that reduced the psychological need for improvisation. But the crew maintained their habits. They inspected the armour daily. They discussed vulnerabilities and contingencies. They had learned that survival required constant attention to detail. The lessons from Devil's Handshake remained with them. During an engagement near Coutances, the new tank took 3 hits. All 3 were deflected by factory armour. Hayes commented afterward, "This is what we needed from the start." Harper agreed but added, "We wouldn't have made it this far without the scrap metal." The improvised armour program continued in diminishing form through August 1944. As newer tank models arrived, the practice became less common. Maintenance battalions shifted focus to repairing battle damage and managing supply lines for the rapid advance across France. But isolated instances of field modifications continued through the fall. Some crews, traumatized by early losses, insisted on additional armor regardless of factory improvements. Others trusted the new designs and abandoned improvisation. The transition was gradual and uneven. By September, fewer than 50 modified tanks remained in active service. By November, the practice had effectively ended, but its impact endured in statistical records and crew testimonies. Harper's company reached the German border in late September. The crew had survived 5 months of continuous combat, an extraordinary achievement. They rotated to rear areas for rest and refit in early October. Harper was promoted to platoon sergeant. Miller received a Bronze Star for actions during the St. Lo offensive. Hayes and Ruiz remained with the crew. They spoke occasionally about Devil's Handshake and the improvised armor that had saved them repeatedly. The memories were vivid but increasingly distant. The war continued, new challenges emerged, but the lesson remained. Ingenuity, applied under pressure, could alter outcomes that seemed predetermined. The scrap metal welded onto Sherman tanks in June and July 1944 was a testament to that principle. A comprehensive study of the improvised armor program was completed by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department in December 1944. The study analyzed data from 4 armored divisions that had implemented field modifications in Normandy. The report concluded that improvised armor increased survivability by an average of 38%, while decreasing mechanical reliability by 22%. Crew morale improved measurably. Tactical aggression increased. The report recommended against formal adoption of field modifications, citing quality control issues and logistical complications. Instead, it recommended accelerated deployment of upgraded factory armor. The recommendation was implemented. By early 1945, M4A3E8 Shermans, with improved armor and suspension, began reaching European theaters in significant numbers. The improvised armor program was acknowledged as effective but transitional. Harper returned to the United States in March 1945 after completing his combat tour. He was interviewed by Army historians documenting battlefield innovations. He described the improvised armor program matter-of-factly. It was what we had to work with. It worked well enough. He estimated the modifications saved his crew at least 6 times. He praised McAllister and the maintenance teams who implemented the program under difficult conditions. The interview was transcribed and filed. Harper resumed civilian life in Ohio, working as a machinist. He maintained correspondence with his crew members. They gathered twice for reunions in 1950 and 1960. Each time they discussed the war, the tank, and the scrap metal that had protected them. The memories remained clear and meaningful. The statistical legacy of the improvised armor program was documented in multiple post-war studies. Estimates of lives saved ranged from 120 to 200, depending on methodology. The most conservative figure, based on documented penetration differentials, was 137. The number represented crew members who would likely have been killed or severely wounded had their tanks not carried additional armor. The figure was extrapolated and uncertain, but grounded in recorded loss rates. The program's broader impact was more difficult to quantify: improved morale, increased tactical effectiveness, and preserved combat power during a critical phase of the Normandy campaign. These factors contributed to operational success, but resisted precise measurement. On a quiet afternoon in July 1989, 45 years after the events in Normandy, James Harper stood beside a restored M4 Sherman at a military museum in Ohio. The tank was not Devil's Handshake. That vehicle had been scrapped decades earlier, but it was the same model, the same era, the same purpose. Harper placed his hand on the hull and felt the cool metal. He thought about the improvised armor, the welding scars, and the impacts that had failed to penetrate. He thought about his crew, about McAllister, about the mechanics who had worked through exhaustion to keep tanks operational. He thought about the numbers, 137 lives, perhaps more, saved by ingenuity applied under pressure. A young visitor approached and asked Harper about his experiences. Harper described the tank, the modifications, and the combat. He spoke plainly, without exaggeration or sentiment. The visitor asked if he considered himself a hero. Harper shook his head. "We did what we needed to do," he said. "The heroes were the guys who didn't make it back." The conversation ended. Harper walked slowly around the tank, noting details, the suspension, the turret, the hatch he had climbed through countless times. The museum was quiet. The tank stood as a monument to an era and a conflict that had reshaped the world. Harper left without ceremony. The memories remained, as did the archived records documenting what had occurred in the fields and depots of Normandy in the summer of 1944. The final assessment, written in a post-war analysis by a military historian in 1952, summarized the improvised armor program succinctly. Necessity drove innovation. Crews and maintenance personnel improvised solutions using available materials. The results were imperfect, but effective. Lives were saved. Missions were completed. The program exemplified the adaptability that characterized American forces during World War II. The file closed without fanfare. The numbers had already spoken. The welded scrap metal, crude and unauthorized, had rewritten outcomes on a battlefield where margins were measured in millimeters and seconds.